Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you are calling in from this morning. I will see the attendees list continue to increase as we let people into the room today. But it's such a wonderful opportunity to meet with you all today and look at this subject that I think has been really important and pivotal to some of the work that many of us do. And this morning's webinar is called The Good Life. Myself is Dan, and I'm one of the national program managers and trainers at Smart Recovery. And I'll introduce our wonderful speaker very shortly. And we're very excited to have him join us today. Today, we're just going to hear a bit of a presentation around some of the work that Dr. Robert Waldinger has been doing, and many other scientists before that, around the good life. We will just hear from Bob shortly, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end as well. We have a few questions pre-made, and we'll listen to hear from you guys. Feel free to drop some questions in the Q&A or in the chat box. But before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, past, present, and emerging in Australia. There are many people calling in from Australia. I'm calling from Brisbane this morning in Quandamooka land. I'm sure there are many others from different countries and cultures all over the world joining us today, which we're very welcome to do. We're going to introduce Dr. Robert Waldinger. I think he prefers Bob. So yep. We're going to introduce Bob this morning. So I've got a bit of a script here, Bob, and it's quite impressive, my friend. Author of one of the 10 most viewed TED Talks of all time, Dr. Robert Waldinger is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and founder and executive director of the Lifespan Research Foundation. A psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, and a Zen priest, Dr. Waldinger is an expert on the tenets of human thriving, developed by leading the Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest running studies of adult life ever conducted, and one that holds powerful insights into health, happiness, and fulfillment. And Dr. Waldinger is the author of numerous scientific papers, as well as 2 books, and directs a teaching program in psychotherapy at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. He has won awards for teaching and research from the American Psychiatric Association, Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts Psychiatrist Society, and he's consistently named as one of the best doctors in America. Well, that is a fantastic introduction, Bob. We're really fortunate to have you join us today. I know that you have a presentation. I'm really excited, and many others to hear from you today. So we'll hand over to yourself, and yeah, let's hear from some of the wonderful work that you've been involved in.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm delighted to get to, to share with this group some of what we have learned about human thriving. So, what I'm going to do now, I'm hoping that this is the right way to share. Does this look good to you, Dan?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So, what I'm going to talk about is happiness. And the study of happiness has only really started in the last 25, 30 years, studying it in any rigorous way. It used to be that we assumed that we as a society were happier if our wealth was increasing, if gross domestic product was increasing in our different countries. And then people began to look, and they found this paradox, which is that particularly in many of the more developed countries economically, that as economic wealth went up, that happiness either stayed the same or it actually went down. And that's when people began to say, we need to study this in a more rigorous way. So the United Nations puts out a World Happiness Report every year, and you can download it. If you look up UN World Happiness Report from 2022, you can download the executive summary or the whole thing. And what they do is they have demographers, sociologists, biologists, psychologists all over the world studying what people say they need to have a good life. And what's interesting about this is that what people tell you they need to have a good life is really pretty consistent all over the world, all age groups, all ethnic groups, and that it does include money up to a certain point. That yes, having our material needs met turns out to contribute to happiness. But when they ask the question, well, how much does having more money increase your happiness? Up until in the US, it was estimated at about $75,000 a year income per household. And it varies, but basically, once you get your basic needs met, then making more money really doesn't make us more happy. So then what do people say in this World Happiness Report? What do they say they need to have a good life? And it's remarkably consistent. People say they need social support. They need to expect to have a healthy life, meaning they need access to decent health care. They need freedom to make life choices. And what we know is that that varies a lot depending on where we live in the world. And one of the more interesting things we find is that people say they need the opportunity to be generous in order to feel like they're having a good life. So not just generous with money, but generous with energy and expertise and time. And then finally, people all over the world say that they need to be able to trust each other, their neighbors, but they also need to be able to trust their governments. And as we know, this also varies tremendously around the world. So given that, what do young people starting out say they're going to need to have a good life? Well, they actually did a survey of millennials, and they did it in 2007, and they went back in 2017. And what they found was that over 80% of millennials said that their major life goal as they set out on life was going to become rich, not just to have their basic needs met, but to get rich. And over half of millennials said that, I'm going to back up for a minute, they said that they needed to become famous, which if you think about it is a really strange desire, to have lots of people around the world know your name and know about you, but really not know very much about you at all. And so they said, we need wealth, we need fame, and we need high achievement. I need to achieve a lot at work. I need to win awards, right? So the then question is, if wealth and fame and high achievement aren't on that list in the UN happiness report of what people feel they need to have a good life, what's responsible for this disconnect? And that's where one of the explanations we think is pretty powerful is that our culture defines what a good life is supposed to be for us, rather than our defining it for ourselves. So if you think about all the messages that we get all day long, you know, from the media, from our phones, from television, from billboards, they're messages about consuming. They're messages that say, you know, if you buy this car, you're going to be really happy. If you serve this brand of pasta to your family, you're going to have joyous family dinners, right? And so we are given messages about what is supposed to make us happy. And that's different from what actually makes us happy. So I love this. I pulled a photo from social media. So this is a Facebook photo, and it's people having a wonderful time at a party. I'm sure you recognize these kinds of photos that we post for each other. You know, and if you think about it, if you were coming from outer space and your only source of information about human life was social media, you would think we were always at wonderful parties and on beautiful beaches and about to dig into beautiful plates of food, you know, because what we end up doing is we curate our lives for each other on social media. We show each other, you know, our happiest pictures. You know, I don't post online pictures of me when I wake up in the morning feeling grumpy or feeling confused or feeling like my life is not amounting to much at all. Like when I'm in those moods, I leave that off of my my public face. And what that means is that we're always putting on our game faces for each other. And I think what's different about Smart Recovery is that's a place where you don't have to put on your game face. But one of my teachers once said it this way, and I really like this, that we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. We're always comparing, the me that wakes up some morning feeling really lost or down with all those happy pictures, or those people who show up at work cheerful all the time and seem like they have life figured out. And what it can leave us with is this wrong impression that everybody else has life figured out and I don't. And that, of course, is not the truth of anybody's life. The other thing that the media gives us is images of how we're supposed to look. So I pulled this. This is a typical underwear ad, right? And I deliberately chose a male body because women's bodies are much more often exploited for these purposes. But if you think about it, we're shown all these pictures of what we are supposed to look like as human beings. When was the last time an ad agency showed us an ad like this, right? It just doesn't happen, right? And so we can end up believing that we look wrong, that we are wrong. This is particularly difficult for younger people who are more vulnerable to these concerns about images, but all of us feel this. All right, so now I'm going to talk about how we really learn about what life is like for real human beings on the planet. So most of the research that is done about human life, we do by asking people to remember the past. And that's not a bad thing. And in fact, asking people to remember the past is a very useful source of information. But one of the things we know is that the human mind creates false memories. Our memories are full of holes. I mean, think about it. What did you have for breakfast on Wednesday of last week? Unless you have the same breakfast every morning, in which case you do know. But otherwise, or what did you have for dinner a year ago on this date? Of course you don't remember, because so much of what happens to us, we don't hold in our memories. We couldn't possibly do. But what that means is that we lose a lot of our experience. So when we want to study what human life is like, we can't simply rely on memory. So I've just started making the case for why I've spent the last 20 years of my career doing what I do, which is following the same people and asking them over and over again about their lives in this longitudinal study. So this study is called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. As far as we know, it's the longest study of the same people going through their lives that's ever been done. It started in the year 1938. And so we're in our 85th year. And it started with two groups of people. It started as two studies that didn't even know about each other. A very privileged group of young men, Harvard College undergraduate students, and a group of very disadvantaged boys, middle schoolers, who were from Boston's, not just their poorest families in the city of Boston in the USA, but the most troubled families. So these were families where there was domestic violence, where there was parental mental illness, where there was parental physical illness. And this study was started because the researchers wanted to know, how is it that some children who are born into really disadvantaged families manage to stay on good paths and stay out of trouble? So we had one really privileged group, one really underprivileged group, both gathered in 1938 and studied to this day. Almost all of the original 724 people have passed away. Only about 40 of them are still alive, and they are in their late 90s or just over age 100. And this is my picture to describe the inner city group. So there were these two groups. And then what we did after we gathered these two groups of men, we brought in the wives. And then we brought in all their children, more than half of whom are women. So we've gradually achieved gender balance in our sample. We're not just a study of men anymore. And when we started, when we brought people into the study, we did detailed physical exams, we did psychological exams, long interviews. We also went to their homes and we interviewed their parents, and our workers took elaborate notes about what was being served for dinner and what was the disciplinary style in the family. Lots of rich social observation. And then these young men grew up and went into all walks of life. Doctors, factory workers, lawyers. John F. Kennedy was part of our study. Ben Bradley, who you might know of, he was the longtime editor of the Washington Post newspaper, who broke the Watergate scandal in the US. So we had people doing all kinds of jobs, from laborers to very fancy jobs. And then over time, we began to study them as they grew old. And then the question is, well, what did we study? We studied the big domains of life. We studied mental health, physical health. The Harvard group was of an age to go to serve in World War II. So they all went off to the war. So we studied their World War II experiences. And then for everybody, we studied their work lives, we studied their relationships, and then as they got older, we studied aging and retirement. And then the question is, well, how did we study it? Well, we asked people to remember the past. We used questionnaires, but we also did medical exams. And then as new methods came into existence, we started using new methods to study well-being. So we now draw blood for DNA, which I find so amazing because DNA wasn't even conceived of in 1938. We put people into the MRI scanner and watch how their brains light up as we show them different images. Again, something that in 1938, the founders of this research couldn't have imagined. We bring them into our laboratory and deliberately stress them out and watch how they recover from stress. All of these are different ways of learning about well-being. And then the question is, what do we learn? And we learned one very familiar thing, which is that you need to take care of your health. If you take care of your body like you're going to need it for 100 years, you're more likely to have it for 100 years. So that means exercise regularly, eating well, getting preventive health care, not abusing substances, not smoking, that all of these things really predict longer life. But the finding that we didn't expect and that we didn't believe at first was that the people who were happiest, but also who stayed healthiest and lived longer, were the people who had better connections with other people. That the people who had better relationships stayed healthy. And it wasn't just the number of connections they had, but it was the warmth of their connections. And at first, we didn't believe this finding because, you know, it makes sense that if you have good relationships with other people, you'll be happier. Okay, that makes sense. But how could having good relationships mean that you'd be less likely to get coronary artery disease or type 2 diabetes? How could that even be a thing? And so what we realized was that other research studies were finding the same thing. And that gave us confidence that this was not just a chance finding in our study, that this is a really robust finding that we can have confidence in. So then the question that researchers always ask is, well, how does this work and what's involved? So one of the things we know is that loneliness, meaning feeling less connected to other people than you want to be, is connected with earlier brain decline and earlier physical decline. And what do we see? Well, lonely people have higher levels of high blood pressure. They have impaired sleep. In fact, in one study, lonely people get poorer care from their healthcare providers than people who aren't lonely. So there are all kinds of ways in which loneliness impairs our ability to take care of ourselves, and it impairs our health. So how does this work? How do relationships get into our bodies and actually change our physiology so that they either promote health or they break down our health? Well, we've been investigating that for the last 10 years in our lab, and other research groups have been studying this as well. And the best hypothesis about this has to do with stress. That what we know is that people who are chronically stressed, including people who are lonely, because loneliness is a stressor, they have heightened cardiovascular reactivity, they have decreased immune function, they have higher levels of inflammation circulating in their body all the time, and that these things gradually wear away and break down different body systems. And so that's how we think being isolated and lonely breaks down the body. And we think that good relationships help us manage stress. I'm sure all of you have this experience. Hopefully you have this experience in Smart Recovery and in other places where when you can talk about what's really going on in your life, when you can share things that are difficult and stressful, you can literally feel your body start to calm down. And that's how we think this works. So one of the fun things about studying people over time is that you can study how things change over a whole course of life. So, for example, we asked people who were married, we asked them the same set of questions about their marriages 8 times over 50 years. And what we found was that people were happiest when they first got together with their partners, which makes some sense, because we're all excited, new love and all that. And then when the first child arrives, our satisfaction with the relationship goes down. But then when the last child leaves home, our satisfaction goes up again. And it only goes back down again if the children come back to live at home. Now this is in the United States. And I realize that other cultures are quite different. So for example, in India, in Latin America, it's very much the norm for children to live at home all the way until marriage and many times after marriage. So this is a finding that's particular to the United States and to certain ethnic groups in the United States. But it's an example of how useful it can be to ask the same questions again and again over the whole life course. Now, one of the things we find too is that relationships, I'm talking about good relationships, but they do not have to be smooth all the time. In fact, they aren't. Relationships that are important always have some disagreements. There's always some conflict. That's not a problem. In fact, when we studied this, we actually videotaped couples having an argument with each other. And they got really into it, even though they knew they were being videotaped. We asked them to talk about the things they usually disagree with. It could be housework or money or taking care of the kids. And what we found was that it wasn't the degree of anger in the argument that predicted which relationships were going to remain stable and satisfying. It was whether there was affection and respect that you could see on a videotape, even when the couple was having their argument. So it's just a way of saying that relationships do not have to be smooth for them to be good. And that it's really worth working on our relationships to iron out the difficulties because there's great value there much of the time. Now, the other thing we learn is what makes us happy when we spend our money. So when we have discretionary income, so you've got extra income with which to, you say, I've got $10 that I can spend, or I've got $100 I can spend this weekend. What do I want to do? And the research question was, are we happier when we spend money on material things, or are we happier when we spend money on experiences? So should we buy, a new shirt or a new coat? Coats are to keep us warm. So, or should we have something more fun? But should we buy a new video game, or should we pay for experiences with other people, like tickets to a sports event, or tickets to a museum, or going out to dinner with a friend? And what the research finds is that the people who spend their money on experiences are the happiest, and they stay happiest longer. So as we say here, the best things in life aren't things, they're experiences. Why is that? Well, it turns out that when we buy material things, they just beg for comparison. So like you can probably see behind me, I have this big flat screen TV. So, okay, I go out and I buy my new flat screen TV and I bring it home and I'm excited about it. But then I go to my friend's house and I realize that she has a bigger flat screen TV. And one of the things we know from good research is that the more frequently we compare ourselves to other people, the less happy we are. When we don't compare ourselves to others, our mood is better. So one of the things about experiences is that they're not like anybody else's. If you and I go to a football game, that's a different experience than somebody else going to the same football game. And we have our own memories of it, right? The other thing that's true about experiences is they usually connect us to others. So this is a picture of a boat on a trip to Alaska that I took with my family. These were people I didn't know before, but we all got to be friends. And I also took this trip with my family, which means it brought me closer to my wife and my sons. That what we find is that experiences usually are done with others, and that's one of the reasons why they make us happy. Okay, now I've been telling you about how important relationships are. Now I'm going to tell you the bad news. This phrase, bowling alone, is the title of a famous book that was published in the United States in the 1980s by Robert Putnam, a sociologist. He did a survey in the US about how much we were investing in what he called social capital, meaning how much are we investing in other people? How much do we join clubs like bowling leagues? How much do we go to houses of worship? How much do we invite people over to our homes? How often do families eat dinner together or take family vacations, right? And what he found was that starting in the 1950s in the United States, everybody stopped doing these things. The drop-off was dramatic. We stopped investing in other people. And that coincided with the introduction of television into most American living rooms. And so what Putnam found was that American families just stayed home, sat in the living room with the lights off and watched the TV, right? Didn't even talk to each other. And then when Putnam went back in the early 2000s, after the digital revolution, all of these things had gotten worse. That joining clubs had gone down by over half. Family dinners and family vacations were much less frequent than they had been even in the 1980s. And in 1983, when Putnam asked people, 12% of Americans said there was no one they could confide in about personal matters. In 2003, that had doubled, so that 1 in 4 Americans said there was nobody on the planet who they could talk to about personal matters. So this is a huge development in our societies, particularly in more developed countries. So what's responsible for this? Well, to some extent, it has to do with the digital revolution, that we are glued to these wonderful screens that are so helpful, right? And so powerful. but we can easily neglect each other. I mean, my wife and I will find ourselves, we go down for breakfast to the kitchen and we realize that like she's doing her email and I'm scrolling through the news and we've hardly looked at each other, rather than, kind of talking and checking each other, checking how we are this morning. And this is so easy to do. I'm sure you've seen many people sitting around a restaurant table where everybody's on their phone. Sometimes they're texting the people they're sitting next to. And what it does is it keeps us from noticing the world around us. This is an iconic photo, of a man who is completely missing what's happening in his world. So the question is, how do we reverse these trends? How do we lean in to our connections with each other, to our relationships? And here, I'm going to use a teaching from one of my Zen teachers, John Tarrant, who said, attention is the most basic form of love. If you think about it, our undivided attention is the most valuable thing we have to give to another person. And it's probably the hardest thing to give these days. That actually one of my colleagues, Linda Stone, writes about what she calls continuous partial attention. And that's what we do now. We give each other only partial attention when we give each other attention at all. So the question is, how can we reverse the pull towards staying on our screens and not really paying attention to the people we care about? And there are a lot of ways, now I don't think I really ought to be showing this slide here, but it's like having a date night, right? It's mixing up, changing the mix and doing something new in a relationship that we take for granted. And my wife and I had a date night every Thursday night when our children were small, and that was so important in creating space where we could just catch up with each other. Family dinners. We know that eating together regularly with family, with friends, is hugely important for our well-being. And certainly it's important for child development. Also, volunteering in our communities. I mean, this makes a huge impact on our social life because when we volunteer, we're much more likely to meet new people, to make new friends, and to feel useful in the world. Now, the other thing that we're finding is that work is a place of tremendous loneliness. And it's a place of loneliness. It was a place of loneliness even before the lockdown of the pandemic. So the Gallup organization does wonderful survey work, and they surveyed 15 million workers around the world. And their primary question was, do you have a best friend at work? And what they meant by that was, is there somebody at work who you can talk to about personal matters? And what they found was that the people who said yes to that question were better at engaging customers. They produced higher quality work. They were less likely to get injured on the job than people who didn't have a best friend at work. But guess what proportion of these 15 million people said they had a best friend at work? Only 30%. So that means 7 out of 10 people don't have anybody at work who knows them as a person. The people who didn't have a best friend at work, those 70%, only 1 in 12 said that they were engaged in their jobs. So most of them were kind of quietly checked out, just showing up. The other interesting thing is when they surveyed CEOs of companies, half of them said they felt lonely. So this happens at all levels, not just among frontline workers. So what we have done actually is taken some of these insights about well-being from our research, and we put it into a program called Roadmaps for Life Transitions. And that's one of the things we're working on now, where we're piloting it with college students and caregivers, people who are caring for disabled relatives. We're piloting it in, telecommunications companies and just lots of different places to see if we can help people use some of what we've learned in this research to make their lives better and more connected. And we have each one is 5. There are 5 sessions in this program that focus on different aspects of well-being. First of all, the perspective of, well, where am I in my life, and how does that affect how I see the world? And then what values are most important to me, and how do I find purpose in my daily life? And how do I build stronger relationships? How do I manage difficult transitions that come along in life? And finally, what are some of the best ways to respond to challenges? What are the ways that work well, and what ways don't work so well? So this is just a program that we have developed that we are continuing to work on, that we hope will be of help to people using the findings of our research. So these are the take-home messages. They're really simple. One is human connection is really important, not just for happiness, but for physical health and longevity. That technology certainly has the power to connect us, but it also has the power to isolate us. And that we need to be more active in structuring our lives, both at home and at work, to combat this kind of isolation, because the path of least resistance these days seems to be increasing isolation from one another. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. And now, Dan, if you want, we can, we can have questions, comments, complaints, whatever people want to offer.
I very much doubt there'll be any complaints, Bob. I think just reading in the chat box there, some of the connections and definitely people just really enjoying what you were sharing today. And we had a few questions before. I was also just even reflecting on some of the work that we do. I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Bruce Alexander's experiments, the rat park experiments, and we think about when we think about addiction, and the findings were that those experiments meant that connection and not being isolated and actually being able to engage in a community, well, it was rats obviously, but it showed that really didn't have the appeal to go back to the cocaine-laced water that served such a. It's amazing to hear that. And really, Bob, after all that, it's fairly simple, isn't it? It's not very complicated.
It's not rocket science.
So just got a question here. So thinking around addiction and stuff, so engaging in his positive relationships obviously is a need and a want that we all have. And it's smart we work through problematic behaviors, drugs, alcohol, gambling. I was struggling to engage in healthy relationships because of those behaviors and the ramifications it has. But how do you think that kind of plays a factor on happiness and how we're trying to get that balance back and find those connections when that's so powerful?
So tell me again, so when the things pulling us away from relationships are so powerful.
And the substance itself is such a powerful, strong relationship the individual has, and removing.
Well, one of the things, I know that you all know this far better than I do, but that often it involves really making connections with people who are not involved in struggling with substance use, right? Because one of the things we know is that behavior is contagious. Like they find even that obesity is contagious, that if all your friends are obese, you're more likely to be obese. And so we know that it's very difficult to move beyond substance abuse and addiction if the people around you are still very much involved in those behaviors. And so so we know that it matters a lot who we associate with. And then what's important, and this can be hard when you've been struggling, is to reach out and to be active in trying to connect with people. But one way that we can do that especially, often when you've been struggling with addiction, you feel like, ugh, I don't have anything to offer. And one of the things that's really helpful is to realize, yes, you have things to offer. You have a sympathetic ear, you have, muscles that can lift boxes if need be. You have, you can volunteer in a soup kitchen. You can read to children. You can tutor kids who need tutoring in school. You can visit people who are shut-ins. There's so many things you can do. And I think that one of the things that's an antidote to some of the shame that we can feel is feeling useful to others. And so if we can find ways to put ourselves in situations where we can be useful, it's very healing. It's very beneficial to other people, and it's very healing for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone was just commenting there, they're studying behavioral economics and really understand the economics of happiness. So can you comment on the nature of addiction / enlightenment and how it doesn't fit anywhere in the hierarchy of basic needs?
Addiction / enlightenment?
Enlightenment, yeah, not quite sure what that was.
Well, I guess it would be, I mean, addiction saps our, our energy, it saps our resources. We know that, right? So we know that, in fact, our time and our energy are so precious. And for most of us, our resources are pretty precious. Our money is, most of us don't have a lot of extra money lying around. So it's clearly, it clearly benefits everybody. It benefits our whole social world when we turn away from addiction. But that's easier said than done, as you all know, doing the work that you're doing. And I think that, I like the word enlightenment. I'm not sure how it slipped in there, but one approach to addiction has been mindfulness. So one approach is to, struggling with an urge to reach for something that's not helpful to us is a struggle, but mindfulness basically suggests bringing our attention to the urge and just being with that urge, not acting on it, but just really watching every bit of that urge arising and crescendoing and then passing away. And so some people use mindfulness as a very powerful way to work with addiction.
Absolutely. And I'm just even thinking of my own journey and even other models out there, the 12 steps. It's that awareness, you need to have an awareness of the problem in the first place. But there came a point in time where you work through those strategies and you engage in the community of recovery. But for me, there came a point in time where I needed to step away from having to spend time with people in recovery, because I needed to move forward and beyond what I thought of myself as an addict, which, I think it is possible to break through that. And relationships and people around me were so pivotal for me finding that new identity and purpose and connection, So it's a balance there for people early on in recovery, and they come to SMART and they hear the stories and connect with people that are going through the same thing. But where does that start to balance out as you move forward? It's very interesting. You did talk about, technology, and it was one question I did pose to you before, which you've fairly answered. But I've just recognized I was doing a radio interview recently, and some of the links around the psychological and brain responses to engaging in social media and phones and stuff is a very powerful. Some of them are saying actually it's as powerful as a response to cocaine. Yet 7 billion of us have them in our hands every single day.
No.
We start to balance that out. How do we start to utilize technology but not let it impact those important indicators that you've spoke of?
Yeah. Well, a lot has to do with how we use it. Some of the research has begun to show that if we use technology actively to connect with each other, our well-being goes up. So, a friend of mine reconnected with his elementary school, his grade school friends during the COVID lockdown. And now they have coffee every Sunday morning on Zoom. They're all over, but they get together and they're thrilled with these connections again. So, you know, tech is not all bad, but
Well, we
what
just
we
said that.
know, I know, I just saw that's like you were just punctuating my point there. But that what we do know is that if we passively consume other people's content, so if we passively consume other people's Instagram feeds, you know, or Facebook pages, that we start feeling bad. Our well-being goes down, depression goes up, self-esteem goes down. So it seems to be that there's a difference between active use of social media to connect and passive consumption. That active use makes us feel better, passive consumption makes us feel worse.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was just thinking about, you know, people that are experiencing addiction and the consequences of that has on relationships. Sometimes even the parent or the people that are primary caregiver to us or those that are involved in that. I guess, how do we start to move away from that? Well, we still have to engage in our community and in our family, but maybe still in the throes of addiction. How do we find those positive relationships if the very people that are close to us are still in the midst of that and probably caused the trauma itself? That must be really challenging to speak of, you know, speak into.
Well, it is very challenging, and it means it's a harder struggle when everyone around you is still in addictive behaviors, for example. And it probably means building at least part of your life away from those people. It doesn't mean you have to disconnect necessarily, although sometimes you do. But it means building another part of your life where people, you know, as someone else mentioned in the chat, where people see the person, see you, the person, don't know you as an addict, just know you as you. And maybe you who has struggled with addiction, okay, but who are really not, they're not living with that struggle, and you're not with them living that struggle. You're living your life in a new way. And so, you know, I think it means to some extent moving away from, in part, those addictive communities, including family members.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was something just James talking about self-care, but it was also a point that I'd had a question. I guess, how does solitude play a part in this lifestyle balance? Because
Yeah.
you know, if you do that too much, we know, you know, solitary confinement, it can send you.
Oh yeah.
It can actually really impact you. But how do you exercise self-care and solitude and keep that balance?
Yeah, yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I think of solitude as being alone when I choose to be alone and when I want to be alone. That solitude can be wonderful. You know, I meditate every day and I sit on a cushion and I'm all by myself. And it's very nourishing. So I think that the question for each of us is, what is a kind of being alone that works for me, that's restorative, that refuels me? And what is being alone that is draining, that's stressful, right? And to really watch and to see, what do you need? How much solitude do you need? How much connection do you need? It's different for each of us.
Absolutely. And I can sense that in myself. Sometimes I love going out and socializing, and then all of a sudden there's a little switch in me, like, I need to go home. I need to go home.
Exactly.
My own space. My wife is probably the opposite. She just absorbs and connects with so many people. And it's amazing.
Yeah.
I guess, just looking if there's any other questions that are coming through. Yeah, yeah, it was an interesting one. You did touch on this, Bob, because in many societies we have a basic needs of food, shelter, high rates of disengagement and depression. But I actually find there are some communities that I speak to that don't have that much, that seem happier and more content. The communities that have everything, as you say, it's kind of empty. So I guess, how did class and poverty and accessibility to these resources end up relating to the happiness of the people in the study?
Oh, that's a great question. What we found was that the inner city group, the underprivileged group, was no less happy on average than the more privileged group. That once people got their material needs met, that it depended on so many other things, mostly on the quality of their relationships and to some extent on physical health. So we had very happy people in both groups. We had very unhappy people in both groups. But privilege is not a recipe for happiness. And lack of privilege doesn't mean you're doomed to a life of unhappiness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about Maslow's kind of hierarchy, if we've got those basic functions, and basic foundations there, I think that's where we can then engage in healthy relationships. But if you're hungry and homeless, it's very difficult to engage in those things as we progress up the hierarchy, isn't it? So
exactly.
Yeah, that's wonderful, wonderful insights. And if there's any more questions just to come through, we've got a few more minutes. I'm just thinking about, peer support as well. In Smart Recovery, we've really identified over the years that the family members need support as well. So we're trying to encourage a bit of a wraparound support that the individuals that are experiencing addictive behaviors come along to the SMART meetings, but the family and friends that are trying to support that individual can go to the family and friends groups as well. So we can kind of see how that relationship connection, how it's so important for success for both of the people that are experiencing some of the distress they're going through. Any other thoughts or comments from anyone? There's one here. It's an interesting one. Did the Harvard study classify people by personality types, as in like workaholics, depressive, neurotics? I mean, it's obviously labeling, but what were the conclusions? Were there different personalities and different assessed that gave different outcomes?
Well, we gave them some personality measures. There's a measure of the big 5 personality traits. Introversion, extroversion, conscientiousness, neuroticism. I'm missing the 5th. Anyway, we did, yes. And, they weren't as powerful as we thought they would be in predicting like who was successful or who was happy. They really weren't. They're thought to be these core personality traits, but openness, thank you very much. Yes. That they weren't such strong predictors of the things we expected they might be.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for Malt there and explaining to Robert his own work. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I get help from this group.
Well, look, we're very fortunate to hear such wonderful work that you're doing, Robert. I'm sure many of us that have joined today, and there'll be many more that we'll be able to share in that journey for you as well. Just for those that are interested to know more, the Robert's website and the Lifespan website that you work through, I'm sure we'll be able to get links from that and the books that are available if you want to read a little bit more. But we're very, very privileged to have you join us today, Bob. We thank you very much. For those that might have joined us that maybe not as familiar with Smart Recovery, please feel free to jump on the website, which you should know because you've probably registered for this webinar for it. But fantastic program. Not that I'm just worked for them myself, but I've been through the recovery journey and I've been in this field for 20 years, and I think it's such a powerful space to enable people to equip themselves for change long term. So feel free to jump on there, and my email address, or contact us for any more additional information. But again, thank you very much, Bob. Thank you so much for everyone that joined us, and we've been it's gone very quickly. This is such a wonderful, interesting topic that you shared with us, Bob. So many blessings to you, and good night to you, and have a great night. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you at another webinar. Our next webinar in May, we have Dr. Anna Lemke from Stanford joining us around her work around the dopamine detox and dopamine nation. So we're looking forward to that one as well. Again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Great, thank you. All right.